Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for yet another day of Professional Care Workers Week. Today is 18th of September, 2025, and we have a very important webinar for you around sexual safety in the workplace. And with recent legislation changes, we thought it would be very helpful for us to share what the changes are and what you can expect, what should you how you should be treated, and what are the employer's responsibilities. So with us today, we have our trustee, Nina Sharma from Bevan Britain, who's going to share with us the legislation changes, and you've got some slides for us, don't you? And we also have Olivia that works for us and who used to be a care worker, but Olivia is also going to share her personal experience, and so will I. So I think we'll start with the presentation first. If there are any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. We'll try to answer them if possible. So over to you, with your slides.
Thanks, Carolina. Morning, everyone. So what I will do is I will just share a few slides I've prepared that'll just give you some pointers as to what I'm going to talk about. So just to introduce myself, I am a solicitor and I advise employers on employment law, and I advise employers specifically in the health and care sector. So what my role is to help employers in the sector that you work in and how to do things properly, how to do things well, how to deal with problems, and how to support their workforce in carrying out their role, which is why they go to work every day. So as Carolina mentioned, there's been some recent-ish changes in the law. So in October last year, October 2024, a new piece of legislation came into effect, which requires employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And we're going to talk about today kind of what is sexual harassment, because certainly for some people, they don't always appreciate what might amount to sexual harassment, and the fact it can be much more than, let's say, kind of your stereotypical inappropriate touching. It can take on a lot many more forms than that, and it's really important that everyone recognizes that they are protected against that and they have the right to protection from that sort of treatment. And then looking ahead, there is actually a new piece of legislation that's coming into force imminently, actually, but actually the various new protections it will provide for employees and workers will come in stages. But in relation to sexual harassment, it's going to enhance workers' protections, and it's going to require employers not to just take reasonable steps. Employers will be required to take all reasonable steps. Now, it doesn't define what all reasonable steps are, but you can kind of see the distinction. The current government, as you'll appreciate, works closely with unions and is very much in support of enhancing workers' experiences and protections at work. And by changing the wording in the law from just reasonable steps to all reasonable steps, that shows that they are now expecting employers to take this very, very seriously and do everything that they reasonably and practicably can to make the workplace as safe as possible. So just on that, as I say, what sexual harassment is actually covers quite a lot of forms and a lot more than you may think. And I think, to be honest, what's sad about whenever I deliver presentations like this is we all can probably think of at least one example when we've experienced this ourselves in the workplace. Because not always, but sometimes behaviours that we see exhibited by other people aren't always right. So just listed here on my slide, we have kind of, let's say, the legal definition of what sexual harassment is. It's unwanted conduct of a sexual nature that has
Sorry,
the
Una,
yeah.
just a second. I
Yeah.
can't see your slides.
Oh, I'm sorry, am I not sharing them? Let me try again. Let's have a look. There we go. Is that any better? Can you see them now?
Yes, now I can see them.
Perfect.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry
you.
about that, everyone. See, I'm not very tech savvy, am I? So I've just listed out here the legal definition of sexual harassment. So as I say, unwanted conduct of a sexual nature that has the purpose or effect of violating someone's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. And what's really important there is the words purpose or effect, because quite often you hear people say, well, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that to come across like that. doesn't really matter what you meant. If it does have the effect of creating this atmosphere for someone, then it will fall within this definition. And another thing that you often hear people say is, oh, well, they didn't say they were upset at the time. It doesn't matter. You don't have to say in that moment, oh, please stop doing that. That's creating this atmosphere. What would a normal, rational person describe that situation as? If it feels inappropriate, if it feels offensive or humiliating, it's probably going to fall within this definition. Now, I've listed here just some examples. These are kind of based on real life stories I've heard, things I've heard and seen myself in the workplace, not my current workplace, I would add. But kind of, this just shows, I say, it goes far beyond unwanted, inappropriate touching. So unwanted touching is one of the examples on the slide, but it can also be things like making conditions of employment dependent on sexual favours, physical acts of sexual assault, stories or jokes referring to sexual acts or sexual orientation, that awful word banter. It can stray into this area. Unwanted touching and unwanted sexually explicit photos, emails, or text messages. Now, as the world's changed and is continuing to change, we're all connected digitally, often in WhatsApp groups, messaging groups with people that we work with, sharing of inappropriate memes and photos that could amount to sexual harassment. So it's always worth thinking about, if something doesn't make you feel comfortable, is it perhaps falling into one of these categories? So as I say, there's a new duty that came into force in October 2024 and is going to be enhanced in April 2026. We don't have the exact date, but it'll be early April 2026. And in summary, what that means for you as workers is you have enhanced protections in the workplace in relation to sexual harassment. And that puts significant obligations on your employers. Now, what I would say is the employers we work with, they already do this because they know it's the right thing to do. And if you feel that your organisation, your employer isn't delivering on these points, then you can speak up, you can suggest it, you can raise it. That's your gift. And it's actually really important that you, as the workers in the organisation, take the opportunity and feel empowered to point this out. So employers are expected to take a zero tolerance anticipatory approach to sexual harassment. What that means is it's not good enough for them to say, oh, sorry that happened, it won't happen again. They have to think through, they have to risk assess in the same way that you risk assess a desk that you sit at for health and safety. They have to risk assess scenarios that you are going into as part of your role and do as much as they can to minimise the risk of exposure for you. Employers also need to facilitate training for all staff levels, particularly managers, on this new duty to prevent sexual harassment. So it's all well and good having a lovely written policy that saves somewhere on an intranet if nobody actually walks the walk, talks the talk. It's really important that everyone knows what it is, what it says, and brings it to life through everything they do. Also, employers have to ensure there's an effective mechanism in place for reporting allegations and also ensuring that reporting is encouraged. Now, some bigger organisations, and certainly if any of you have worked in NHS trusts, they often operate a system called DATIX, DATIX, which is an online anonymous reporting portal. Now, I appreciate in some other organisations, there may not be kind of capacity or resource to have that sort of portal. And also, not everyone accesses a computer every day. So kind of submitting electronic complaints isn't always as straightforward as it sounds. But as a worker, if you feel your employer doesn't have or you're not aware of the mechanism they have for raising concerns, absolutely speak out and ask your employer, what's the mechanism for me to raise any concerns I might have? And they should point you towards that. And it should be clearly signposted for everyone as well. Now, in terms of enhanced protection, if your employer does not adhere to this new duty and you suffer sexual harassment at work, you are entitled to bring what's called an employment tribunal claim. So it's free to bring that sort of claim. It is a legal claim, but you don't need a lawyer. You can do it all from your phone, or you just fill in a PDF form if you just Google employment tribunal. And if you win in your claim, the employment tribunal will award you compensation. Now, the level of compensation depends on kind of the severity of the harassment you've been exposed to. but it can basically vary from about £7,000 up to about £60,000. It really does depend. What I would say is that the process of going through an employment tribunal claim is stressful, not very pleasant. So I would encourage you to think about perhaps alternative options for enforcing your rights. You can still point out that you've been subjected to sexual harassment at work, but just, kind of think carefully before you go down this route, because it may be that you want to minimize the level of stress you're exposed to yourself. And on the next slide, I've set out some free sources of support and legal assistance if you think you have been subjected to sexual harassment, so you can explore your options. And finally, just worth pointing out that, yes, another reason why employers should take this very seriously is that if an employer is found to have permitted or facilitated sexual harassment in their workplace, the Equality and Human Rights Commission does have enforcement powers. So a bit like the Home Office, they can turn up on site, they can issue fines, public what's called unlawful act notices. So these are really potentially really big problems for employers. So it's really important for them, for many reasons, that they work hard to avoid sexual harassment happening in their workplace. So as I say, I've just listed on this slide here some free sources of support. If you do feel that you've been subjected to sexual harassment at work, or you'd just like to get some more advice about any of the points I've talked about, these are all free. And I've mentioned to Carolina and Olivia, I'm happy for these slides to be shared around, so you'll get these as well. But that was all the kind of the points I was going to present about. So I'll just stop sharing my slides. There we go. So I hope that was useful, just a bit of a high level summary.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. And I think the thing that really stands out is that it's not just the intention, but what was actually the effect. So how people feel matters. Because I did some research on this a few years back when CQC are doing a guide to sexual safety in social care. Unfortunately, they went only the route of people who receive care, and different drafts had it in or out. I would put quite a lot of work into that. Anyway, and having spoken to some people, I think the main thing that came across was, I was just told I misinterpreted what somebody was trying to say. I misunderstood. That wasn't the intention. So I'm glad that this recognizes that just the intention doesn't matter. How it makes somebody feel, the effect of certain behaviors matters as much. Olivia, are you still okay to share with us your experience? And then, it would be helpful if you could then maybe talk about, in the light of this recent legislation, the changes that you're saying are coming, what should be the behavioral actions on the employer's side as well? And Olivia, we really appreciate you sharing your experience as well.
No, of course, thank you. I thought I'd do like a very brief introduction as well, because as Carolina mentioned, I work at the Care Workers charity. I'm the policy and projects manager, but previously to joining the charity, I was a care worker, and I have experience in both residential and domiciliary care, mainly delivering dementia and palliative care. So I think the first thing really is that when I was receiving the training to become a care worker, I was told that inappropriate touching, especially from those drawing upon care and support, was to be expected, and therefore it was kind of seen as a natural part of my role. I think where my story begins to differ is when I experienced sexual harassment and assault at the hands of a colleague. They were making unwanted sexual comments towards me, sexual jokes at my expense, and also there was the unwanted sexual touching as well. Other colleagues of mine noticed how they were acting towards me and encouraged me to speak to my line manager. At this point, I was experiencing a great deal of anxiety about actually going into the workplace, just in case I was put on a shift with them. And I remember kind of actually having panic attacks pretty much every day before work because I was so worried that I would come into contact with them again. I didn't actually know the process of making a complaint. I didn't know where to go, who I was supposed to speak to. So I just immediately went to my line manager. I was called into a meeting with them where I launched a formal complaint against this individual. I was told that it would be dealt with accordingly, and I was told that I would have complete confidentiality in launching this complaint as to not exacerbate any of the kind of situation at hand. I was also told that because this individual was still on probation, they could be let go with immediate effect after an investigation had been launched. So quite a bit of time passed and there were no further updates. I think perhaps what got to me most was that there were no protections in place for me, knowing that I had launched this kind of formal complaint. I still had to work in close proximity with this individual, delivering intimate personal care to individuals behind closed doors. And that's it's quite a vulnerable position to be in when it's just you and this other person that you've launched a formal complaint against for sexual assault and sexual harassment. Where it kind of then got a bit more difficult is that my confidentiality was leaked to the individual that I'd launched a formal complaint to by my line manager. This made it quite difficult because they now knew that I had complained about their actions towards me in the workplace. And I was told and actually warned by one of my colleagues not to come back in because they were going to make my life a living hell for complaining. I then was called into another meeting with my manager. No apology was made to me for my confidentiality being breached. And I was told that nothing could be done because they were short-staffed and they needed this individual to continue working because they couldn't find somebody to replace them. So that's when I then made the decision to leave to protect myself from any further kind of sexual assault and harassment, and also just to protect my mental health as well, because it was incredibly draining on me. Since then, I've heard nothing about any form of investigation that went on, and pretty much as soon as I left, it was just laid to rest. So that's my experience.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for sharing. We really appreciate it. And I'm sorry that's your experience. Your comments, of which I'm sure you have a handful.
Thank you. Thanks, Olivia, for sharing that. I appreciate it. Can't be nice for you to go over it again. And just, yeah, as you were telling us, I was thinking all the things that your employer did wrong. And then the ridiculous thing at the end is they told you they couldn't do it. They told you they were choosing not to do anything because they didn't want to lose that member of staff for short staffing, but then you left anyway. So their approach actually, it resolved nothing. I would be amazed if that person hasn't done it again to someone else and the problems persist. Yeah. So just I'll go through kind of the points you said and what to give everyone else on the call some comfort. I'll point out the things that your employer should have done. Nothing that I'm suggesting is wild. It's not unreasonable. It's advice I would give to any employer, and it's what the good employers would do, just to make everyone feel a little bit better. So you mentioned that kind of touching from service users, it was outlined in your new starter training that would be standard. Yeah, we get, we all get that. And I've spoken to other employers in this sector who say similar things. But I've also spoken to other employers who say they make it very, very clear, not just in the training, but in the recruitment exercise. And where this kind of aspect of the role that's, let's say, unavoidable has been spelt out more clearly, it ensures that everybody gets off to a better start. It means that, and not that this happened to you, but say other people who weren't comfortable with that, they're far more aware that this is an unavoidable aspect of the job. It makes it much better for everybody, for their colleagues, for the new starter, for the employer. But I would say leading on from that, that's quite a big thing. That's not, in my role, I don't deal with that on a day-to-day basis. So employers should recognise that just saying that is just part of it. They should then also ensure that there are resources available for people who may well experience that as part of their role, be that through kind of access to counselling, access to employment assistance programs, which should all be provided for free, just through kind of more regular drop-ins, sessions with line managers, with peers. So that would be kind of a recommendation that I'd make just from the outset. Now, in relation to your specific circumstances, it was evident here from what you've said that that employer did not have a culture which fostered speaking up, by the fact that your colleagues were noticing things. They were encouraging you to raise it with your line manager, but nobody, including yourself, really knew how to do that. And it shouldn't be that the only avenue to raise a concern is to your line manager. Because what if your problem is with your line manager? What if the line manager is not necessarily the right person? What if, for whatever reason, you wanted to speak to somebody, another female perhaps, or somebody who was of a different age? It can't be that the only avenue for raising a concern is to the line manager. So employers should make sure they have in place a mechanism, as we talked about, for raising concerns, and particularly anonymously. So that DATEX system that I mentioned that the NHS uses, it does enable you to raise concerns anonymously. So that would be something that I would have wanted the employer to have in place here, which evidently they didn't. The fact you kind of had to just sort of pick up and make your own way through a process to find out how to raise your concern isn't ideal. Now, the way they dealt with your concern is it was unlawful. So when you raise a complaint at work, it's normally labelled as a grievance. That's okay. That's the legal word. And kind of the framework that employers have to follow when dealing with grievances, it's very clear. So ACAS, which is a free at arm's length body, which assists employers and employees in resolving disputes, they actually have a statutory code of practice on how to deal with grievances, which says very clearly grievances should be investigated and concluded as soon as reasonably possible. Well, as you said, when you left, it's still nothing had been progressed. So they had breached their duty to adhere to the ACAS code of practice. They also should have had in place their own internal grievance policy, and they may well have done. It may well have been buried somewhere on the internet, but legally, it should have been in your contract of employment where you can access the grievance policy. And that clearly wasn't, because none of you knew how to raise a complaint. So they've messed up there. Now, we all get that sometimes, as I say, policies can be beautifully written, but the actual application of them might not be as straightforward. And employers can perhaps be forgiven for not getting sort of procedure quite right. But what they do to resolve that and what they do substantively is important. And they didn't get that bit right here either. So this point around the confidentiality is dreadful, and it's really concerning at their approach. You made clear you wanted to raise your concern anonymously. What they should have said to you, and this I appreciate doesn't sound very nice, but it's the reality, that person would probably have been able to work out who is raising the concerns, unless he was doing it to literally everybody. But in order to, for fairness, when you conduct a workplace investigation, if somebody raises concerns about someone, the person who's accused has to be kind of given the right of response in some way. And you have to know kind of the details of the allegations to be able to respond, don't you? So the thing with anonymity is it is really difficult, and I fully appreciate it's often the barrier to people actually enforcing their rights, because I get it, they don't want to waive their anonymity. They don't want it to be known that they've raised a concern. But that shouldn't have been your concern. The employer should have done a lot more to comfort you and say, we get that you want to remain anonymous. You know, we can't hand on heart guarantee you that the person won't work it out, but I want to assure you, you will not suffer because you've raised this concern. We will do everything we can to protect you. That's what they should have done. You should have left that meeting with your line manager feeling a lot more assured. You didn't. They should have written to you to confirm kind of where they were up to with the investigation. They didn't do that. Your colleague who told you they would make your life hell for complaining, they should have been, I would say, disciplined, because they themselves have gone against kind of enforcing or fostering this culture of raising concerns. The individual who was subjecting you to the sexual harassment, they certainly should have been subject to investigation, and once the investigation had established that what you were saying was absolutely happening, they themselves should have been subjected to a disciplinary process. You know, all these people were operating in a care environment, a regulated CQC regulated environment. The CQC takes this sort of stuff really seriously, and if you have an organisation where this sort of stuff is happening, it can go directly to the heart of if the CQC downgrade the assessment. So the employer really should have taken this a lot more seriously and recognised the impact this was having. And all of this was clearly just allowing this very negative culture to permeate, wasn't it? And it resulted in you leaving. The breach, the confidentiality breach, technically that was a breach of your data protection rights. So again, you could, and I appreciate why you wouldn't have wanted to, but you could have complained to the ICO, it's the regulator for data protection. You could have complained to them. So in all, you know, I would have told your employer to do things a lot more differently. And then, you know, we all get that things go wrong. All this happened, you left. Somebody should have reached out to you afterwards. Somebody should have said, we know we got that wrong. We're really sorry. Please, can we talk to you? Can we let's take some learning from it. What they should have done, one thing I missed out, is as soon as you complained about him, thinking about what we've talked about fostering the safe environment, they should have changed the working arrangements to protect you, but also, and I know this didn't happen, but let's just flip it in the other way. I know, and we all know that sometimes malicious complaints can be raised about someone, and that's not what happened here, but I do actually see it quite a lot. Sometimes in the workplace, people fall out with each other and then they raise concerns and they're, you know, malicious. To protect him, they could have thought about redeployment. Obviously, that wasn't a concern here, but the fact they were made aware of a serious situation and did nothing, it was just completely the wrong thing to do. They should have looked at redeployment, changing up your shift rotas, bringing in another person to work alongside you or him. And the fact they didn't do anything of that is incredibly short-sighted. So yes, in a nutshell, I would advise them to do everything very differently. But I appreciate for you, Olivia, all of that with hindsight. It's really easy for me to say that. I know that. And that's why this new duty that's coming in, the idea is that all of the worry and the stress and anxiety you experienced, you should never have experienced it. And so if employers adhere to this new duty, if you are exposed to that sort of situation again in the workplace, it'd be not you, someone else was, it'd be much easier for them to take steps to tackle it and feel much more protected.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Going back to what you said about, and what Olivia said, that, you know, in training it was said, if there's any kind of abuse or harassment of that nature from people, she was going to support, just to accept as part of the job. Heard that from many care workers. One of my experiences, and I have to say there have been many in this area, unfortunately, was when I was working for a home care agency in London, and I was supporting a man who had a stroke but also had Alzheimer's. And I was asked, well, I was supporting him for quite a long period of time. He lived with his wife, so I was covering her breaks. So I was going in so she could go out. And after a year of doing that, she decided she wanted to have a night or two a week to herself, going over to her daughter's house, and asked me and the agency if I could cover those nights, because she trusted me to do that. So particularly during those nighttime shifts, this man became verbally aggressive, but also in a way of making suggestions around sexual acts I should perform for him, getting very angry, verbally abusive, pulling me in to get into bed with him, and just generally being, in his head, in his state of mind, it was an expectation that if I was there as a woman in his house, I should do whatever he wanted to do. Interestingly, in his life, he traveled quite a lot and worked in different parts of the world. And from what he told me, every city he worked in, he had a girlfriend. So I think it was part of his life experience to actually have that expectation. So I would say it wasn't necessarily only a consequence of him having a stroke or dementia. When I raised it as an issue, both with his wife and with the agency, I was told it's just a part of the job. That's it, carry on. When I said I wouldn't do the night shifts anymore, because it really was very, very stressful, very difficult. It wasn't a small suggestion, it was quite over long periods of time, every evening, going on and on and on, or calling out to me in the middle of the night. Yeah, when I said I won't do those night shifts anymore, I lost the whole shift pattern and all of the hours. And in home care, at that time, to me, that meant losing around 15 hours a week overnight, which took a while to fill in with other hours. So, and I think that's the kind of position that many co-workers find themselves in, is people they support, particularly with cognitive issues like dementia, when it's like, oh, it's not their fault. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're saying. We can't really, I think, specifically judge what they know, what they're saying, what they're doing, because capacity fluctuates. And also people have interesting different ideas about life and what they're entitled to or not. So was there anything that my employer should have done? And any kind of routes for action, I think, for other care workers, because it is, I think, quite a common thing from what we've seen and heard, and how care workers can protect themselves, especially in a situation where we have a care sector with a lot of vacancies, and many employers would say, oh, I can't move you off this shift because I don't have anybody else to do it, or the client really likes you, you are their favorite, and to keep family happy, you need to be going there.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, that's one word for it, that when the wife was spoken to about it, she said it's just part of the job, or that's what your employer said. Well, employers and workers should feel more empowered to say, okay, we get that's part of the job, but that's not acceptable. You see it everywhere you go. If you go on public transport, we will not accept abuse towards our staff. Your employer should stand up for you more in that scenario. The culture that is part of their organisation, and culture is key to working relations, it's everywhere. And with care, there are multiple sites that amount to the workplace. As you've said, this was a home care role. It's not good enough for them to just allow a client, regardless of how good a client they are, to set the tone like that. And, kind of just accepting the client saying that in light of the new duty wouldn't be good enough. Your employer and you as the worker, and appreciate it's hard when it's one person, but together should make clear to the client, we get that that's part of the job, but it's not acceptable to just brush it under the carpet like that. And we need to work together collaboratively to come up with a plan to deal with this, because this isn't acceptable. And this is exposing the care worker, who you're saying is making your life easier. It's exposing them to risk and to harm. And yet no actual harm might not have happened, but that doesn't matter. You don't need to physically experience actual touching to have experienced sexual harassment, and that can impact on your mental health. As Olivia mentioned, her mental health was impacted in her scenario. So I think it's important, care workers should feel empowered to say that's not good enough, we can't brush that under the carpet. And equally, the employer should now be carrying out, as I say, a risk assessment, and this should be part of it. I think in this role, there should have been real consideration as to whether it was appropriate for a lone female to be on their own with this individual for so long. And I think actually a decent and detailed risk assessment would have come to that conclusion as well. And there should be then with a conversation with the wife again to say, there's too much risk here. And unless you are willing to stay in the house with the worker, which obviously is the point, you want to go away for the night, we need to look at changing it up. So we're not saying sending 2 people, we're appreciating there's probably not budget for that, but changing up the way this works and having a team of people. I think when you've got any person receiving care who's presenting such challenges, understandably, I think it's right to have more than one care worker assigned to them anyway, for a variety of reasons, because, you know, we all go through things, don't we, in life as part of our role, and you need to be able to take a step back or you'll burn out, your mental health will completely deteriorate. Just having one worker assigned to this person doesn't mitigate against that risk. I think as well, any worker who is allocated to work in such challenging situations, there should be support mechanisms around them by way of regular one-to-ones with their line manager, so they can debrief, talk about what's going on. And through that, the line manager should then think, okay, we might need to do another risk assessment here. We might need to look at another conversation, because obviously things change. People's health needs themselves change as you go through time. But I think it would have been really beneficial for you to have some peer support, access to counselling, perhaps access to the employee assistance programme. And I think as well, what's really obviously was really horrible for you in this situation is when you raise these legitimate concerns, which you were complaining about sexual harassment in your workplace. That's what you were doing. In raising a concern like that, you are actually protected. So a concern like that is called a protected act in the UK. And as soon as somebody raises we call it carrying out a protected act, so raising a complaint of harassment or discrimination, you are protected. You weren't protected at all in this scenario, were you? You actually suffered a detriment. So we get that in some scenarios, the answer may well be we have to just change out the care worker. But that shouldn't be to your detriment. The employer needs to look carefully about, okay, well, what can we do to make sure that you don't lose out on those hours? That's what they should have done here. They should have planned the rotas much better. Now, I get that everything I've just outlined is a to-do list for the employer, but that's what being an employer is. You have a lot to do to protect your staff, because you are getting the benefit of having staff. We call it the benefit burden of having employees. There's tremendous benefit to having employees because they're making money for you. So there are some burdens that come with having employees, but that's what I would advise in this situation. But what happened to you is not, as you said, it's not an unusual scenario. So employers should not roll their eyes at having to deal with that. They should have that baked in the process for dealing with it properly.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So as we're in the flow, I'm going to throw a couple more examples at you of different, if that's okay.
Of course.
I think that's probably the most useful way of talking about this on particular examples. So another, again, my personal experience, when I was a live-in care worker with a lady in the South, her son used to come to the house quite often, and he would make a lot of very inappropriate comments, and there would be inappropriate touching as well. And I think that makes it even more difficult because it's like almost one step removed, because it was a family member. Living care situation is complex in the first place because you're there all hours of the day and night, and it's very, very difficult to have a break of any sort. Considering that the family member isn't an employee of the organization you work for, and it isn't also the person in receipt of care, is there anything an employer can do in that kind of situation if a complaint was raised?
Yeah, and they absolutely should do something about this. The fact that kind of the harassment was being carried out by a third party doesn't absolve the employer. It's happening out in the workplace. The workplace in this situation just happens to be the person receiving the care, their domestic setting. In terms of the new legislation, so actually over the last sort of 10 years, there's been quite a bit of back and forth about, we call this liability for third party harassment. So kind of the example I was thrown out is somebody's working in a reception in an office, a delivery driver comes in with a parcel and says something racist or sexist to them. Now, in 2010, the then Tory government wanted to bring in protections for the receptionist in that scenario, but it didn't quite get through. The House of Lords chucked it out, went back and forth. But with the new Labour government, that is going to be coming in 2026, protection against third party harassment. So that's what's happening in your scenario here. So employers absolutely should do something about this, because otherwise they may well face a claim, a legitimate claim from the care worker for third party sexual harassment. So the employer should, the care worker should feel empowered to speak up and speak about this and that they're experiencing it. And the employer should feel empowered to say to whoever is the contact in that scenario. So it might be difficult because it may well have been the son who was directly contracting with the care agency about the mum, but there will be other people involved in that relationship. There may well be GPs, other medical practitioners treating the mum, and the employer should feel empowered on behalf of the care worker to reach out to those third parties and say, this is happening, this stops immediately, our worker is not being exposed to this any longer. And I would very much encourage the employer to do that, because as I say, the risks for them are huge. And the risk is, kind of the immediate risk is their worker. So you in the scenario, you might refuse to carry out any more work. You might resign like Olivia did, and then they're down a member of staff. The bigger piece is the kind of innocent female receiving the care in this scenario might lose out on a fantastic carer and a relationship that really helps them. The employer might face, as I say, a legal claim, which could be worth a lot of money, which would be public as well. So it could impact on their CQC rating, their brand as an employer. They might find other clients don't want to work with them anymore. And the care worker may experience, as I say, mental health issues, which might turn into long-term ill health conditions, which mean you're not able to work, and you might have claims for loss of earnings against the employer as well. So the employer should absolutely do something about that there. And the worker as well should feel empowered to speak up, because that's not okay. And nobody is ever going to say that they shouldn't say to you that you should just accept it and get on with it. It's part of the job, because it's not part of the job. It is part of the job, but it's not acceptable to just say it's part of the job.
Thank you. You said the claim would be made public. Does that go for all those type of claims that go to a tribunal?
Yes, so all claims in the Employment Tribunal are a matter of public record, and the judgments are published on a database. So if you just Google Employment Tribunal judgments since 2019, everything's been on there. Now, that can be good and bad, because whilst yes, the employer's name is out there, so is the employees, and we recognise that. And that's often why many employees or workers don't want to bring legal proceedings, because they don't want to unfairly be labelled a trouble causer, which is why I do encourage people, if they think they have concerns or they want to look at kind of their rights, do explore those free resources for legal advice, because there are ways to resolve these disputes before they get to the Employment Tribunal. But yes, otherwise it's very public. You can, in very, very rare circumstances, apply for what's called an anonymity order, where names aren't reported. I have, in my whole 12 years, never seen one granted. And I've seen people apply for one where they were having to go into detail, very detailed explanations about letting the worst prisoners in and out of prisons and how the gates were worked. The tribunal still wouldn't grant an anonymity order then. So very rarely do you get one.
Okay, very interesting. And I think, like you said, it is a big barrier probably for people doing that. One last one. Where does the law lie with care workers being sent into homes of people on the official record for sexual offenders? Can the employer let the care worker know? Does the care worker have a right to say no? Obviously there must be some protections for the individual on the offenders list as well, and also in receipt of care. So where is the line? Imagine a care worker is being sent into a community, into a home of a registered sex offender, but she hasn't been told they are. And for example, she has past experiences of being sexually harassed and abused.
Yeah. So just on that last point, that is really interesting. What employers should recognise is that we're all different and we all have different experiences, and they shouldn't treat everybody in the same way. And by that I mean, don't just assume that everybody can manage every situation in the same way. And something might be really upsetting for one person, that's not upsetting for another. Think back to the definition of harassment, it's the effect. So whilst I'm not saying employers should sit down in the interview and say, tell me all your backstory, as part of the pre-employment process, there should be meaningful, genuine inquiry made about anything the employee or worker wants to share, and see if that needs to be taken into account when planning their work. And also the fact that people's lives change. So it could be that something happens like happened to Olivia or to yourself in the course of employment, which means looking ahead, this person's kind of vulnerability may now be heightened. So factor that in. Taking it a step back to what you were saying about if somebody's on the official record. So there are, I don't know these rules in details, but there are definitely mechanisms underpinned through data protection legislation in which it is permitted to disclose certain aspects about somebody to somebody who might be providing them with care. It's called a lawful basis for processing. And I would say in your scenario, the employer, as we've talked through today, has a legal duty to take steps to prevent sexual harassment. That is a lawful basis for ensuring that everybody who has to treat somebody is aware of the fact that they, if it's true, that they're on the register. Because the employer needs to ensure everyone knows the potential situation they're walking into, and that this may well be a potentially dangerous situation. So yes, the care worker can be told where it's appropriate. They don't necessarily need to be told more detail than that, than they're on the register. And the flip as well is, it's not just about disclosing to the care worker, it's about what the employer does after that. So if you just have that dropped on you as a worker, you're going to be understandably very worried. So your employer needs to make sure they tell you, don't be too anxious. Here's what we're going to do to protect you in that scenario. We've had more complex conversations with the service user's family than we would normally do. We're going to, we've agreed with them that there's going to be more than one of you at any one time. We're going to have that rota system in place to ensure nobody's put in too vulnerable a situation. Now, having heard all that information, the care worker can decline to go into that scenario unless, let's say, they were specifically recruited for that individual. If they then were to say, no, I'm not working with them, that could be quite tricky. There could potentially then be an argument that, well, you can't, you're kind of declining to carry out your role. We can't continue to employ you in that role. But if the care worker has worked for this organisation for a long time, was not specifically recruited to work with this person, and having been presented with all the information does not feel safe, they are absolutely entitled to say, I don't feel safe in this scenario, unless and until something changes, I'm not willing to go back into that environment. They are protected in that scenario. And we go back into the first one you talked about where you were doing ad hoc nights. It shouldn't have been, okay, we're just taking you off the rota and you don't have the hours to backfill it. So there are definitely protections for everybody in that scenario, yeah.
Thank you. Just on the point of being specifically employed for this individual, or could an employer try to go around it by advertising, supporting people, including sexual offenders, in the general ad, and then if somebody is then recruited under that ad, then they cannot refuse to work with such individuals?
So it's not unreasonable to refuse to work in a scenario that's putting you at risk. And I think the worker, nobody applies for a job. You know, firemen get protection, don't they? They know they're going into burning buildings, but they get the protection. So in that scenario, if an employer was to suggest, well, you read the job description, you knew the drill, you can't turn the job down, I would push back and say, no, you made them aware of the circumstances of the working arrangements. That doesn't absolve you of any requirement to protect them.
Okay.
And, you know, there's an overlap here with employment law and health and safety law. So all employers are legally obliged to operate what's called a safe system of work. So having fire extinguishers, having lifts and stairs if there's a fire, having heating and air conditioning, having running water. This goes to that. This is in the same vein. So if an employee, if a worker says, I get the circumstances I'm going to need to work in, but they need to not expose me to risk, you need to put in place measures to avoid the risk. That's absolutely fine. And any employer who pushes back on that is not a very good employer, I would say.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. I think it's very reassuring to see that legislation is changing to protect people more, to protect workers, care workers more. I think what's important for people to remember is that by knowing the legislation, by knowing what's there, how you should be supported and protected, you can help yourself. And thank you for sharing the resources. And there are places where you can go and ask for help. And I suppose personally, I would encourage people to speak up, because it's very difficult working with people and supporting people. It's sort of talked as an imbalance of power towards the care worker, because the person receiving care is perceived and is talked about as the vulnerable individual. But I think what is forgotten is that the care worker can very well also be the vulnerable individual in the situation. And I think particularly in home care settings, live-in care settings, when there is one-on-one care, and then it ends up being he said, she said, and there are no witnesses, there is nobody to help. So yes, I would encourage everybody to know your rights and know the legislation, and B, if something is wrong, to seek some advice and help and to speak up. And I hope that today's webinar, and thank you very much, Nina, for sharing all of the information, has helped you learn and puts you in a much better position to speak up for yourself in the future. But first of all, I hope that not too many of you are put in a situation where you have to speak up. But if you do, now you know better what your rights are and what you can do. Anything else from you, Annette or Olivia?
No.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you for those who are going to watch later. Please share it as widely as possible and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.